Michael is one of the top 3 professors that my husband has worked with in 25 years of executive business education. That is quite a statement coming from my husband. So now, Michael will talk about why Grand Rapids is not Flint, the elements of civic well-being.
Thank you very much. Okay, now that the expectations are unreasonably high, thank you very much, Pam. I appreciate that. I really am tempted to start, though, by asking what Judy meant when she said you're no longer feeling any pain. What exactly goes on here? And how can I get invited? Is the next question. So, the title needs a little bit of explanation. Why Grand Rapids is not Flint? You might be wondering, well, why Flint? Why put up there why Grand Rapids is not Poughkeepsie, or why Grand Rapids is not San Francisco? And any one of you can come up here and talk about those differences. And if the presentation starts to go badly, I will invite somebody to come up and start talking about that instead. This has a very particular historical context. A man named C. Wright Mills, noted American sociologist, probably one of the most influential American sociologists of all time, was asked, when he was a young man, just after the war, World War II, to work with one of his colleagues, an economist named Frederick Ulmer, to do a study that was commissioned by one of the post-war congressional committees on what direction the country should go in terms of supporting small businesses or large businesses. What's the relationship of a community made up of mostly small to medium-sized businesses and civic well-being, and the relationship of communities like Flint, which was, of course, dominated by General Motors, and the relationship of that company to civic well-being. And so they came out with about a 32-page report early on in 1946. 1946. I don't expect you to necessarily be able to read this. It got buried in lots of ways, has been rediscovered here and there by scholars digging things up. And until the 1990s, a PhD student at Cornell uncovered that nobody really knew who the 6 paired cities were that Ulmer and Mills used. It turns out that Grand Rapids and Flint were two of the cities that they came. They applied a number of measures to try to figure out what's the relationship between the industrial organization and civic well-being and prospects. And spoiler alert, I'll give the conclusion away. They thought that a place like Grand Rapids, in the long term, based on the measures they used, was a much better place to live. It was going to have much higher civic well-being than Flint. This was not either intuitive or obvious necessarily to anybody at the time. If you go back and look at what was being written about Flint and in relationship to that Detroit, they were both regarded, some of you may remember the 50s or 60s, I don't know. Probably so many of you weren't alive then, I remember. That Detroit and Flint were considered to be the epicenter of the American dream. That's where you would go to make your fame and fortune, if not a fortune, at least a secure life, a pension, part of the union, health benefits, employment for life, etc. And in fact, in 1950, Flint was regarded as the happiest city in Michigan. Not so long ago, right? I mean, you remember that. So that's the basis for this. At the time, they used something called Thorndike scale or G-score, access to health, libraries, how many people got the paper, who voted, what sort of voluntary associations were alive and well in these communities, level of education, infant mortality, a whole range of measures. They, out of the many, Mills and Ulmer used 37 and came up with this score, as you see, that showed Grand Rapids and Kalamazoo as well, scoring higher than these one industry towns. We didn't so much want to replicate the study as we wanted to take a look at some of the questions that it raised, again, in terms of the business or industrial organization of a place and its relationship to civic well-being. So in 1946, Those numbers, if you're looking for a balanced economic life, which means that there should be a fair number of industrial firms representing the number of fields. There was some mobility back and forth between those, high levels of skill. That high income brackets shouldn't just completely overwhelm or dominate low income brackets. There should be something like a more or less even spread. As you all know, throughout the country, including Grand Rapids, the income inequality has gotten only greater rather than less. Civic well-being, how many people graduated from high school, from a talent grade, who goes to museums and libraries, how many of them are there, who reads the paper, that sort of thing. In 2015, which is the latest that we have the updates for, part of that is we wanted to look at the relationship of public to privately held companies across the country. As you know, if you are publicly held, on one hand, that seems to suggest, or has suggested in the past, that contributed greatly to the increase of the middle class, that large corporations, GM and others, employed significant numbers of people, especially people coming back from the war, and offered them a pretty secure way of life. What we've learned in the meantime, though, is that the Minneapolises, the Pittsburghs, the Grand Rapids of the world, places that have large numbers of privately and family-held businesses, in the long run, for a number of reasons, again, seem to do better. Again, we looked at things like teen pregnancy rates, the percentage of college. This is something I didn't know until recently, and that is, in the recovery since 2008, even though there's an awful lot of talk about it being related to service jobs and that sort of thing, in fact, over 90% of the jobs that have been created since the 2000 recovery, according to Robert Reich, have required some college or a college degree. So premium on education is still there. And then who volunteers? How many people volunteer? What do people go out and vote? Are you all registered to vote? Your demographic tends to vote with much greater, not only numbers, but sincerity, I think, than the demographic that I deal with most of the time, which are students who are just getting up to speed. 1946 conclusions. The small business cities provided for their residents a considerably more balanced economic life than the big business cities. The general level of civic welfare was higher, and the differences were due largely to the industrial organization. Now there's one other factor in this that's not up there, and it's what Mills and Ulmer came to call the difference between the dependent middle class and the independent middle class. And so I talked about large corporations employing huge numbers of people and helping to develop and create the jobs that became known as the middle class, and that's true. One of the things that's happening currently as the General Motors and IBMs of the world get replaced by the Googles and the Apples, Google and Apple employ a fraction of the number of people of those large industrial firms. And it means that you get something like the difference between this dependent middle class, if those who don't have a lot of options. I'm in this large corporation, I know what I'm doing, there's more or less a ladder, but if it all goes, there are not a lot of places to go. Part of that is because the networks tend to be more or less internal. You're not connected across the community to other industries terribly well. Whereas Grand Rapids had a tremendous number of what he termed the independent middle class. People who are well connected beyond their industry, well connected in the community, and had fairly high skills because of having to wear a number of hats in small to medium-sized businesses that were publicly or family held. And those of you coming from businesses like that, you know oftentimes you are prevailed upon to do lots of things that you don't actually really know how to do, but you figure them out.